The wind howled that afternoon, carrying the salty scent of the ocean through the air as waves pounded relentlessly against the jagged rocks below. It was one of those summer days when the beach seemed alive, not just with people, but with the chaos of nature. The tide was higher than usual, the sea foaming with energy, daring anyone brave enough to challenge it. It was on this very day, exactly a year ago, that my daughter, Lily, disappeared into the waves. I still hear her laughter sometimes, echoing through the house as if she were running through the hallways. Her giggles had always been infectious, so full of life and innocence. But on that day, everything changed. The world darkened, and life became a shadow of what it once was. People say that time heals all wounds, but whoever said that never lost a child. The memory of that day is a scar, one I can't stop picking at, replaying it in my mind like a film reel stuck on repeat. We'd gone to the beach, something we rarely did as a family. It was my husband, David, who insisted. He said it would be good for us, some time to relax, to forget the mundane routine of everyday life. Lily had been ecstatic. She adored the ocean, always begging to go, even though we hardly ever found the time. That day, she couldn't stop running in and out of the water, her tiny feet leaving prints in the wet sand, her blonde hair glistening in the sunlight. But the ocean was rough that afternoon. The lifeguard's red flag flapped violently in the wind, warning beachgoers of dangerous currents. Stay close to the shore. I called out to Lily, my voice barely audible over the crashing waves. She waved back at me, smiling so brightly that my heart ached with love. David had been restless the entire day, pacing back and forth along the shore. He wasn't a patient man, never had been. I remember watching him stand at the water's edge, his hands on his hips, staring out at the horizon as if the ocean itself were an adversary. "She's going too far out," he muttered at one point, his jaw tightening. "She's fine," I said, though unease had already begun to creep into my chest. But I didn't call Lily back. Maybe I should have. Maybe if I had. It happened so fast. One moment, Lily was splashing in the shallows, her laughter ringing through the air. The next, a massive wave crashed over her, pulling her under. "Lily!" I screamed, running toward the water. David was already ahead of me, charging into the surf. But he stopped after just a few steps, the waves knocking him back as he hesitated. "She's gone!" he yelled, his voice panicked. I screamed, pushing past him, the cold water hitting me like a slap to the face. But I couldn't find her. The current was too strong, the waves too wild. She was gone. The days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. Rescue teams scoured the coastline, but there was no trace of Lily, no body, no sign of her anywhere. The ocean had taken her, swallowed her whole, leaving nothing behind but an unbearable emptiness. David and I drifted apart after that. He threw himself into his work, avoiding the house, avoiding me. I think he blamed himself, or maybe he blamed me. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. A year passed, and the pain remained as fresh as ever. I avoided the beach, couldn't even bring myself to look at the ocean. It was a monster, a thief that had taken my child and left me hollow. I was sitting at home one quiet evening, the sound of the television playing faintly in the background, when there was a knock at the door. It startled me. No one ever came by unannounced, especially not this late. I hesitated before getting up, my heart pounding inexplicably as I walked toward the door. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Standing on the porch was a girl, her hair tangled and damp, her skin pale and weathered. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing, because standing there, alive and breathing, was Lily. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand gripping the edge of the doorframe as if it could keep me upright. The girl standing in front of me was the spitting image of Lily, her tangled blonde hair, her big blue eyes. She was thinner, her cheeks sunken, and her skin pale and raw, as if she'd been exposed to the elements for far too long. It couldn't be her. But it was Lily. I whispered, my voice barely audible. The girl didn't say a word. She simply stared at me, her expression blank, almost mechanical. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to step closer. "Where have you been?" I asked, my words tumbling over each other. "How did you—" I stopped. There was something off about her. Her gaze wasn't the lively, curious one I remembered. It was distant, almost empty. Behind me, David's voice boomed from the living room. "Who's at the door?" I turned to call him, but when I glanced back, Lily stepped forward, her bare feet scraping against the porch. Her sudden movement made my heart leap. "David!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. He appeared a moment later, his brow furrowed. The second he saw her, his face went pale. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping past me. He squatted down in front of her, his hands on his knees as he searched her face. "Is this a joke?" he snapped, looking up at me. "It's not a joke," I hissed. "It's her." David's jaw tightened. He reached out and gently touched her arm, as if he needed to confirm she was real. "Where have you been?" he asked. "How are you here?" Lily's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer. We brought her inside. My hands shook as I helped her to the couch, wrapping her in a blanket. She let us move her, touch her, but she didn't speak. Her eyes darted around the room, taking everything in like she was trying to piece together a puzzle. David paced back and forth, his hands raking through his hair. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. "She drowned, Ellie. We watched her go under. How the hell is she standing here right now?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was sit beside her, holding her cold, trembling hands. "We need to call someone," I said finally. "The police or—" "No," David snapped, cutting me off. "We can't tell anyone about this." "Not yet." "Why not?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Think about it," he said. "They'll take her from us. They'll think we're crazy, or worse, that we had something to do with what happened a year ago. We need to figure this out on our own." That night, we tried to get Lily to sleep in her old room, but she refused to leave the couch. She curled up under the blanket, her eyes wide open as she stared at the ceiling. I sat with her for hours, watching her, waiting for her to say something, anything, but she didn't. When David finally convinced me to go to bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. Where had she been? How had she survived? Why wouldn't she speak? And why did she seem different? The next morning, I woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen. I bolted out of bed and rushed downstairs, expecting to see Lily sitting at the table with her usual bright smile. Instead, I found her standing in front of the sink, staring at the faucet as water poured over her hands. "Lily," I said softly, approaching her. She didn't react. Her gaze was fixed on the running water, her fingers trembling under the stream. I gently touched her shoulder, and she flinched, stepping back abruptly. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She glanced at me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or confusion. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. David came downstairs a few minutes later, his face tired and lined with worry. "Did she say anything?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "No," I said, shaking my head. "She hasn't spoken at all." He sighed, slumping into a chair. "We can't keep this a secret, Ellie. We need to get her checked out. Something's wrong." Before I could respond, Lily walked past us, heading toward the front door. "Wait!" I called after her. She didn't stop. I ran after her, grabbing her arm just as she reached for the doorknob. "Where are you going?" I demanded, my voice cracking. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, she spoke. "I need to go back," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Back where?" I asked, dread creeping into my chest. She didn't answer. We didn't let her leave the house after that. David insisted we keep all the doors locked, even during the day. Lily didn't fight us. She didn't even seem to care. She just wandered the house aimlessly, staring out windows and touching things like they were unfamiliar to her. But as the days passed, I started noticing strange things. Sometimes, I'd find wet footprints trailing from the bathroom to her bedroom, even though I hadn't seen her use the shower. Other times, I'd catch her standing perfectly still in the middle of a room, her head tilted as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. And then there was the smell, a faint, briny scent, like the ocean, that seemed to cling to her no matter how many times she changed clothes. David dismissed it as paranoia, but I knew something was wrong. This wasn't the Lily I remembered. By the third day, the unease in the house was suffocating. Lily's return should have been a miracle, a reason for joy, but it wasn't. It was as if her presence carried the weight of the ocean itself. Cold, heavy, and unknowable. David tried to keep busy, throwing himself into tasks around the house, but I knew he was just avoiding her. I couldn't blame him. There was something about Lily now that was unsettling. It wasn't just the silence or the way she seemed to glide through the house like a shadow. It was the small things, the details that didn't make sense. Her movements were too precise, her expressions too blank. It was as if she were mimicking life, not living it. But the worst part was the way she would stare out the windows, always facing the ocean, her eyes unblinking. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and nudged David awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned, rolling over. "It's probably just Lily," he mumbled. But something about the sound wasn't right. The steps were slow and deliberate, heavier than hers should have been. I got out of bed and crept into the hallway, peering down the stairs. The house was dark, but I could see a faint light coming from the living room. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. Lily was standing in the middle of the room, her back to me, staring at the blank screen of the television. The faint glow of the street lights outside illuminated her figure, making her look almost translucent. "Lily," I said softly. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, my pulse racing. "What are you doing?" Slowly, she turned to face me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Her eyes were darker than I remembered, like the blue of deep water, and there was a faint sheen of moisture on her skin. "I need to go back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back where?" I asked, my throat dry. Her gaze shifted toward the window. "To the water." The next morning, I told David what had happened. "She said she wants to go back to the water," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Ellie, she's traumatized," he said. "Of course she's acting strange. She's probably confused or scared. We need to give her time." "Time for what?" I snapped. "To pretend she's the same little girl we lost?" "She's not the same, David. You know it as well as I do." He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he was just as scared as I was. Over the next few days, Lily's behavior grew stranger. She stopped eating entirely, refusing even the smallest bites of food. She wouldn't drink water either, but sometimes I'd catch her standing at the kitchen sink, running the faucet and letting the water pour over her hands. Her presence in the house became almost ghostly. She would appear in one room, then another, as if she moved without sound or effort. I started locking my bedroom door at night, not because I was afraid of her, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me while I slept. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found Lily sitting on the floor of her bedroom, staring at the wall. "Lily," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "Please talk to me. Tell me where you've been. Tell me what happened to you." She didn't look at me. Instead, she whispered, "It didn't let me go." "What didn't let you go?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her eyes finally met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "The ocean," she said. "It keeps calling me back." That night, I had a nightmare. I was standing on the beach, the waves crashing against my feet. The water was cold, pulling at me, dragging me closer to the depths. In the distance, I saw Lily standing on the surface of the water, her arms outstretched. "You let me drown," she said, her voice echoing across the waves. "No," I shouted, running toward her. "I tried to save you," but the water rose up around me, swallowing me whole. I woke up gasping for air, my skin damp with sweat. The next morning, I found David sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale and drawn. "She was outside last night," he said, his voice shaking. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "I woke up and saw her through the window," he said. "She was standing in the yard, staring at the ocean. I went out to get her, but when I called her name, she just disappeared." Disappeared. She was gone, Ellie. One second she was there, and the next she wasn't. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. That evening, I found wet footprints leading from the back door to Lily's room. The door was ajar, and when I peeked inside, I saw her sitting on the bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Lily," I said, stepping inside. She looked up at me, her expression calm. "I need to go back," she said again. "Why?" I whispered, tears filling my eyes. "It's where I belong," she said simply. I couldn't take it anymore. David's insistence that we keep everything quiet was gnawing at me. Lily's strange behavior, her whispers about the ocean, the way she seemed to disappear and reappear, the wet footprints, was too much to ignore. I felt like I was unraveling, and David wasn't helping. "She's not normal, David," I told him late one night as we sat in the living room, the faint hum of the television filling the silence. "Whatever came back, it's not her. It can't be." He glared at me, his jaw tight. "Stop saying that. It is her. She's been through hell, and you're acting like she's some kind of stranger." "She is a stranger," I snapped. "You've seen the way she acts, the things she says. She's not the same Lily we lost." "She's traumatized," he argued. "We need to give her time to adjust." "Stop jumping to conclusions." "Time to adjust to what?" I shot back. "To being something she's not?" David stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Where had Lily been for the past year? How had she survived? And why did she keep saying she needed to go back? At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night to the sound of movement. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The house was quiet, but I could hear the faint creak of floorboards coming from Lily's room. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, my footsteps as quiet as possible. Her door was slightly ajar, and when I peeked inside, I saw her standing by the window. She was staring out at the ocean, her hands pressed against the glass. "Lily," I whispered. She didn't turn around. I stepped into the room, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" She finally turned to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes looked darker than ever, and there was an intensity in her gaze that made me want to back away. "I told you," she said softly. "I need to go back." "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why do you keep saying that?" "Because I don't belong here," she said. "It let me come back, but not for long." The next morning, David insisted we act normal. He was in denial, I knew that, but I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Lily was growing more distant, more detached. She barely acknowledged us anymore, spending most of her time staring out the window or sitting silently in her room. And then there was the ocean. She was drawn to it in a way that didn't feel natural. Every time I looked at her, I could see it in her eyes, a yearning, a pull she couldn't resist. A week later, it all came to a head. It was a stormy evening, the wind howling and rain lashing against the windows. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard the back door creak open. I rushed to the door and saw Lily stepping outside, her blonde hair whipping around her face as the rain soaked her clothes. "Lily!" I shouted, running after her. She didn't stop. She moved toward the beach with a purpose, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand as she approached the water. "Lily, stop!" I screamed, my voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. David came running out behind me, his face pale with panic. "What's she doing?" he shouted. "I don't know," I cried. "She keeps saying she needs to go back." We followed her to the edge of the surf, where the waves crashed violently against the shore. Lily stopped just short of the water, her small figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. "Lily, come back!" David yelled. She turned to look at us, her expression calm and eerily serene. "I have to go," she said. "No, you don't," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "You're home now. You're safe." "This isn't my home," she said quietly. And then she stepped into the water. David and I lunged forward, trying to grab her, but the waves were too strong. They pulled her in, dragging her under. I screamed, thrashing against the current. David grabbed my arm, holding me back. "It's too dangerous," he shouted. "She's our daughter." I cried, struggling against him. But it was too late. Lily was gone. We searched the beach for hours, calling her name, scanning the waves for any sign of her. But she didn't resurface. By the time the storm passed, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the water. David and I stood on the shore, drenched and exhausted, our voices hoarse from shouting. "She's gone," David said finally, his voice hollow. I stared out at the ocean, my heart breaking all over again. And then I saw it, a figure in the distance standing on the surface of the water. It was Lily. She looked at us for a long moment, her eyes filled with something I couldn't describe, sadness, maybe, or acceptance. And then she turned and walked into the horizon, disappearing into the mist. I stood frozen on the shore, watching Lily fade into the mist, her small figure swallowed by the vast, endless ocean. David clutched my arm, his grip trembling. She walked on the water," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't respond. My throat felt tight, my chest hollow, and my mind was racing with a truth I'd been too afraid to face. This wasn't Lily. Not really. The silence between David and me grew heavier in the days that followed. We didn't speak about what we saw, but I knew he was replaying it over and over in his mind, just like I was. Lily had come back to us. There was no denying that, but whatever she had become, whatever force had allowed her to return, wasn't something we could understand. The strange behaviors, the distant looks, the whispers about going back. It all made sense now. The ocean had taken her a year ago, but instead of letting her go, it had made her into something else, something that didn't belong on land. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself consumed by the memories of that day on the beach. I couldn't stop thinking about how David had hesitated, how I hadn't called her back sooner. Guilt ate away at me like a disease, and every night I woke from the same nightmare. Lily standing in the waves, her voice echoing. "You let me drown." David, on the other hand, seemed determined to forget. He threw himself into his work, leaving the house early and coming home late. He didn't mention Lily once, but I couldn't move on. One night, I decided to return to the beach. The sky was clear, the moon casting a silvery light over the water. I sat on the sand, staring at the waves as they rolled in and out, their rhythm hypnotic. I thought about everything Lily had said since she returned. The strange, cryptic phrases, the way she always seemed drawn to the ocean. And then I thought about what the man at the search and rescue team had told us a year ago. The currents in this area are unpredictable. If she was pulled out far enough, her body might never resurface. But what if it had? As I sat there, the tide began to rise, creeping closer to where I was sitting. I should have moved back, but I couldn't. Something about the water felt alive, like it was watching me. A sudden memory flashed through my mind, Lily's last words before she disappeared into the sea. It didn't let me go. The realization hit me like a wave. The ocean hadn't just taken Lily. It had claimed her. The sound of footsteps behind me snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned to see David standing there, his face pale and drawn. "I knew you'd be here," he said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" I asked, wiping tears from my face. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, sitting down beside me. "This whole thing, it doesn't make any sense. It's like I'm losing my mind." "You're not," I said softly. "Neither of us are." We sat in silence for a while, watching the waves. Finally, I broke the silence. "Do you think she was angry with us?" David frowned. "What do you mean?" "For letting her drown," I said, my voice cracking. "For not saving her." He shook his head, but he didn't say anything. Suddenly, the waves grew louder, crashing against the shore with an intensity that made both of us sit up. The water seemed to glow under the moonlight, a strange, unnatural shimmer that sent chills down my spine. And then we saw her. Lily. She was standing in the waves, her hair wet and tangled, her pale skin almost luminescent. "Lily!" I cried, scrambling to my feet. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at us with those deep, dark eyes. "What do you want?" David shouted, his voice trembling. Lily tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like hers, she said, I came back because it wanted me to. What wanted you to? I asked, stepping closer. Her gaze shifted to the horizon. The ocean, she said simply. It brought me back, but only for a time. I felt a cold knot form in my chest. Why? I whispered. Lily's expression didn't change. Because it needed me to see, to understand. Understand what? David demanded. She looked at him then, her eyes locking onto his with a piercing intensity. That you can't escape what you've done. David's face went pale. What are you talking about? He stammered. You left me, Lily said, her voice steady. You could have saved me, but you didn't. That's not true, he shouted. I tried. I ran into the water. You stopped, she said, taking a step closer. You saw the waves, and you stopped. I looked at David, my heart sinking as the truth hit me. He had hesitated that day. I'd seen it, but I'd buried it, too afraid to face what it meant. It's not my fault, David said, his voice shaking. I couldn't save you. Lily didn't respond. She just stared at him, her presence heavier than the air around us. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze to me. You didn't stop him, she said. My breath caught in my throat. What? You knew, she said. You knew he wasn't strong enough. You should have stopped me from going out there. Tears streamed down my face. I'm sorry, you whispered. Lily stepped back into the waves, the water rising around her. The ocean doesn't forget, she said, and neither will I. We watched in stunned silence as she disappeared beneath the surface, the glow of the water fading with her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The weight of her words hung over us like a storm cloud, impossible to escape. The ocean had claimed her once, and in its own way, it had claimed us too. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.